This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. It's been a very busy stretch here, and I hope you all caught up on President Vo Van Thung's resignation last week, as well as the previous episode of the podcast about the anti-corruption campaign. Today's episode, meanwhile, has nothing to do with any of that. If you pay any attention to issues surrounding climate change, you'll come across the word resilience all the time. The literal definition of resilience is, quote, the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties. Though this dry phrasing can't account for the nuance of addressing resilience when it comes to people and places like Vietnam. This country is famously, or perhaps infamously, one of the most exposed countries in the world to climate impacts. People here are undoubtedly resilient, as history shows, but the future is going to strain even the sturdiest communities in every country, including Vietnam. That being said, this is not a climate change episode. Instead, it looks at some of the building blocks of resilience, including literal buildings. My guest is Mai Nguyen, a civil engineer by training who has studied around the world and, according to her website, is an entrepreneur, a sustainability, ESG, and climate resilience advisor, an occasional investor, and a work-in-progress creator. In other words, something of a Renaissance woman. Her diverse interests are evident in our conversation, which covers, among other things, the importance of generational local knowledge to resilience, the opportunities and challenges of more inclusive urban planning, Vietnam's struggle to build affordable housing, and her hope of using urban art to drive conversations about resilience and climate. Let's get to our discussion. Mai, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Of course. And apologies if there's any background noise. One of my neighbors is running a generator for some reason. I don't know why. But just to start, you work on a lot of different topics, have a lot of different interests. Would you mind just briefly kind of describing to listeners your work and your background in sustainability, climate resilience, and ESG investing?
Sure. Well, I contain many things. I am trained as an engineer and urban planner. And I have also worked in the financial industry for some time. Over the past decades, my journey has been some zigzags between what I study, what I work, and what I volunteer for. But the spiral center has always been sustainability and resilience. After spending some time on the technical side, I decided to shift my focus to finance and investment. So I started building upon my undergrad backgrounds in real estate investment by learning more about economics and finance and investment. ESG investing is a broad term, but at the same time narrow in the context of sustainable development as a whole. And I touched upon that area a few years ago. Now I find myself in a position where I have the freedom to create using the tools and skills that I've gained over the years, though sometimes it feels like navigating through a jungle. I also engage in writing, including academics and newspaper articles. And one of my favorite areas of interest is entrepreneurship. So I've been actively participated in several fellowship and entrepreneurship programs, many as of which focus on climate tech in the US, in the UK, and Africa as a judge and a mentor. In Vietnam, now with the support of many others, I maintain the connection between Vietnamese and American planners through the American Planning Association.
Yeah, that's an impressive amount of topics and engagement. Makes me feel a bit narrow in what I focus on, to be honest. I'd like to largely focus on kind of the sustainability and resilience topics. That's actually how I came across your name in an article a few weeks ago, which we'll kind of get to. But you mentioned climate resilience, or maybe I mentioned it, but what does climate resilience mean to you when it comes to urban design, urban planning, and buildings?
Right. So before anything else, I think resilience is a valuable characteristic, not only in this context of urban planning, but also in general. So consider resilience in your daily life. What does resilience mean to you? How do you overcome difficulties and keep moving forward? Then take that definition and assume that you are building. how do you sustain yourself regardless of outside force to protect your loved one, and in this case, the occupants living in the structure. So similarly, consider this concept and apply if you are a neighborhood, if you are a city, or even if you are a country. So this is how I see resilience in urban plannings and buildings.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how are you seeing this translated into planning or buildings in Vietnam? I mean, I know, obviously it's a developing country. Resilience is still maybe a relatively new concept here in some ways compared to certainly, I guess, the EU or places like that. But what are you seeing here?
Yeah, I don't think resilient is something too new. So in
Mm.
general, structural resilience has been existed since people start building structures we live in. So it's not
Okay,
a
I stand
it's not
corrected.
a it's not a new concept or anything far-fetched. But I think now is the time we need to re-emphasize. It's because we're facing more frequent hazard events, right? So going back to the questions of climate resilience in Vietnam, and I think in Vietnam, like every other market, I would say there are two main groups. The first one is commercial projects, and the second one is individual housing. So for commercial project, they have more resources to build strong structures which could sustain natural hazards. And also there are financials and technical incentives available if they actively look for many tools and products also designed for commercial projects.
Mm.
Right? On the other hand, individual housings belong to a more vulnerable group in a sense that they have very limited financials and technical resources to deal with sudden hazard events. So it's harder for them to prepare and to recover. However, in Vietnamese, there's a saying, trong cái khó ló cái khôn, meaning that you'll find opportunities in
Mm.
difficulties.
Okay.
So if you visit coastal areas, for example, in Quảng Nam, in Da Nang, or some places in the central part of Vietnam, you might learn a lot about tips and experiences of how local people prepare and protect themselves and protect their properties when storm comes. But again, due to limited resources, damages are inevitable when storms are stronger. Um, what I meant here is, for example, if you are planners and you want to plan or design some project for local people, it should not be one way approach. Like if you stay in a remote office and you design for these people, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But rather, it's to visit the areas and learn from the local practice, and again apply it to your design. I think that would be the best approach for a designer to
Yeah.
improve the resilience of
Mm.
the
Yeah,
building.
that does make, and yeah, I didn't hope I didn't sound dismissive earlier because it is a good point that you need to contextualize things locally, and as you say, people in central Vietnam or the Mekong Delta, what have you, have been dealing with local risks for centuries. I mean, they may be accelerating now thanks to climate change, but there's a lot of local knowledge built in. And then also regarding green buildings, so I mentioned I came across your name in a recent article in Mekong Eye, a great independent news outlet regionally that I'll share in the show notes. But you said, and I'll quote you here regarding building green in Vietnam, the political will is there, but since green construction is not something binding, translating it into a reality is a long road. Would you mind expanding on that point a little bit?
Yes, right, sure. So maybe let's travel back in time.
Mm,
I give you a little bit of the histories of green building in Vietnam.
please.
Uh, so back to late 2000s, I think around 2007 or so, the concept of green building started in Vietnam. Not long after that, around 2010s, the ministries of construction, they paid more attention to this topic and in fact mentioned green building in some of their documents. And I remember it was around 2014, I was invited to a consulting seminar in Thái Nguyên province. It's a remote area, so no one could escape. Um, the MOC invited around 30 experts to have an in-depth discussion about the sustainable city guidelines, which then issues by the Ministry of Construction in, I think, 2015 or so. So what I meant was the government's always supports going green. And recently, as you know, Vietnam pledged to be net zero by 2050, which is a bold step towards the sustainable development goals. But on the other hand, the MOC cannot impose, right? They can only encourage developers go green. It's hard for the MOCs and also for everyone else to impose such practice on developers. So developers, of course, have many constraints. They need to make feasible business case and take care of their workers, which should be priorities. I'm not saying that going green requires trade-off of caring less for their workers. I mean, this is a new approach, and it takes time for developers to understand, to try it out, and gain experience before they can actually practice green. So, in other words, it takes time to penetrate the concept into the market and into the practice. However, in fact, now it's after more than 10 years, almost 20 years, the concept started in Vietnam. There are many examples of enterprise that they dare to try early on and now have learned and realized the true benefit of being green. So those companies now truly have the competitive advantage and capabilities, not only in Vietnam market, but in the ASEAN market also. They have the capacity to work globally as well.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm curious what you think of. There's Vietnamese architecture firms. I think Vo Trong Nia is maybe the most well-known internationally, but several firms here that are kind of focused on, I think the word is like bioclimatic or something like that building. So, more bamboo or using local materials, trying to provide shade from obviously the powerful sun, depending on where you are in the country. But what do you kind of make of the rise of those architecture firms here?
Yeah. So there's going back to the capabilities, right? So because we've been talking a lot about green building and relevant concept for a while, and then we also talk with students when they still studying, and then after again 20 years, the designing firm, they are now more active, and they even propose this sustainable solution to developers, and in a way they contribute to the collective force to put the market forward, because eventually they are the people who do the work, right? They design, and even without the developers or their client requirement, they still can try to integrate green solution into their design, as long as it doesn't raise the cost for the client. I really appreciate those kinds of initiatives taken by architects and engineers and planners.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to see. And I think one Hanoi architecture firm just won a major international award as well for their designs. So you mentioned cost, for example. I know I've written a bit about green architecture in the past, and there's kind of this belief that it's more expensive, which I guess depending on the materials, maybe upfront it can be, but the belief is in the long run it will be more cost effective. So what are some of the challenges to building green or building for climate resilience?
Right. So first of all, I would say there's no shortage of technical solutions. Of course, at the beginning, this could be more expensive, but then, as the technological development, the price of product will go down. And the hard part is how to identify the intensity and frequencies of hazards that the structure will face during the lifetime, let's say at least 100 years. So every piece of data about climate is also dynamic and moving. Every scenario is just prediction, right? we would never know which will come to pass. So engineers and planners will have to use the best resources available to design, to plan, and at the same time consider resources constraint. So by this, I mean both nature's and financial resources. Back to the question you said, it could be more expensive to go green and resilient. So oftentimes, the most vulnerable group is the one with the most limited resources. So this even elevate, those obstacles and the challenge for designer and planner. If you work for commercial projects, maybe they have some financial capabilities. But if you want to design a resilient house for local peoples, it's hard. It's hard to just like put more cement or put more concrete, right? So I think that is one of the current challenge that we need to find a better solution.
So you mentioned a couple minutes ago, kind of there's no legal regulations binding developers or anything like that to certain standards. Do you know if there's discussion of creating regulations like that? I mean, I know some countries do have such rules. Again, I know that can add cost to certain companies, which maybe a developing country won't want to do. But do you know if that's discussed here?
Going back to the original definition of sustainability, is there even no right standard for that? You can save 20% of energy use in the building, but also you can save 30% or 15% also counts, right? So usually in other context, in other cities, for example, in Boston, that I have some experience working in Boston, so they have some articles also to encourage developer to go green. They have some requirement, but also it's not like if you don't do green building, we won't give you the permits. There's no something like that.
Uh-huh.
It's sustainability and green building and resilience is a little bit different from others requirements like firefighting. So firefighting has really direct impact on the people's lives, but sustainability can wait, right? So I think the best that the impose from government could do is to take more bold steps to encourage that and mention it more often in some legal document, and perhaps maybe have some sort of incentive, not necessarily financial, but maybe I give you more of, the GFA if you go green, for example, or I accelerate your paperwork process if you go green. That could be some of the example if the government would like to accelerate the journey.
Pivoting slightly to something that the government is trying to accelerate, and I think is related to resilience, and you've written about recently, is affordable housing in Vietnam, which newsletter readers will be somewhat familiar with this. I've covered it a few times here. A major issue, especially in cities like here in Ho Chi Minh City, where housing is increasingly expensive and kind of out of reach of the average resident, which this is getting discussed a lot in local media. It's not just me saying that. But what's your assessment of this topic, and why have you decided to start writing about that?
Well, affordable housing is, I think, it's a universal problem, right? It's happened in every city,
Yeah.
and it's that getting more of a problem in Vietnam in recent year. And we can say that the government is taking more aggressive steps to increase social housing, right? If you read from the news, but I think there's also what I write. There's no clear definition of affordable housing in Vietnam yet. The only one we have is social housing. So social housing, by definition, is only to serve certain groups. For example, workers in industrial zones, people who previously worked for the government, and veterans with disability, for example. And social housing usually receive subsidies from the government. So in a way that social housing is not 100% commercial, but affordable housing is. So I think this is one of the bottlenecks in the affordable housing framework, because if you don't have a clear definition, it's hard to issue any incentive and guideline. And I think this is one of the reasons why some supporting programs that haven't been implemented as expected yet.
Mm.
So the questions like who is eligible to buy, or what kind of evidence or document that one need to provide to be qualified to buy. So some kinds of like go around, come around problem is blocking the implementation of incentives.
Mm.
And the second point is more about technical. So the second point is how to ensure the qualities of such low-cost housing project. So there's no secret, as you know, is over the media that there's many social housing projects as now empty
Mhm.
due to the low quality, right? So in my opinions, I think we should maximize the potentials of the private sectors. Perhaps, for example, public-private partnerships or PPPs could be a solution in improving social housing or affordable housing.
Thanks for kind of defining the difference between affordable and social. It has been, on the affordable side. I think it's become quite striking. I know that, again, as you said, this isn't a problem that's unique to Vietnam, but month after month now, there's articles in, again, media here where it says, we badly need affordable housing, and then the next day there's an article saying 90% of new apartments in Ho Chi Minh City are in the luxury sector. Of course, that's part of market economics, I guess. But yeah, the social housing side is interesting because I think it's been a year or two now since the government announced like a $5 billion credit package, and I think, kind of as you said, it hasn't been implemented quite as hoped. But anyway, for anyone kind of wondering, I don't know what that all this maybe has to do with resilience. How important is affordable or social housing to the resilience of communities?
Oh, right. So we're going back to very basic. So city
Mm.
are based for people to live in, right? And people live in houses, not on the street, obviously.
Mm.
So affordable housing has always has the biggest demand. It's not only solve the living problem, but also brings about economics and social values. It fills in somewhat the gap of wealth inequalities and social segregation. So imagine a city without affordable housing. You'll see a lot more homeless people. But on the other side, you'll see a lot of super rich neighborhood. And I'm sure that no one is happy living in such a city in which, the wealth is too far.
Mm.
And the problem do not stop at rich poor problem, but it also about crime rate, health problem, safety and securities, and it will affect the quality of life in general to the poor, also to the rich, and to everyone in between.
And I will say Vietnam is, of course, we don't see that many homeless people here, and crime is relatively low, especially compared to, if you look at, I'm from the U.S., some cities in the U.S., and I suppose maybe there's a bit of a difference here as well with kind of the tradition of multi-generational households, which I mean, better than
Right,
me, but I think is fading slowly, but is still like, it's not uncommon for two or three generations to live in under one roof.
right.
But but
Asian, it's Vietnamese and Asian culture.
but of course, for younger people who do want to maybe strike out on their own, it is, I suppose, getting a little bit more difficult to find a decent place to live.
Right. And we heard, the same problem in Korea, for example. Young people, it's really, really hard for them to find a house to buy because of this strike in the real estate price.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. So maybe trying to get a little specific, because we've been talking about resilience and sustainability and those sorts of things. Are there any urban development projects or maybe particular buildings in Vietnam or in perhaps Ho Chi Minh City that you think are a good example of something you'd like to see more of?
I would say, in general, we trying,
Yeah.
This country is trying.
Hmm.
It's reflect from the government efforts, city authorities to individuals who design and plan the city. Also, it's harder to improve existing cities as opposed to building new ones. Well, how well we there are some efforts and initiative in replanning some parts of Saigon, if you heard of it, or the new Thủ Đức city,
Mm.
and all of these projects are set to integrate sustainable and resilient criteria. And we hope to see more, positive outcome from now on.
Mm.
And well, personally, I recently learned that some project building, not a city as a whole, but some building, they are in the coastal lines of Vietnam, in the central areas, in the Đà Nẵng, Quảng Nam, that's areas. They has been in operation for more than 20 years, and the structure, the main structures, stay still ever since they start the operation. And often they have to face a lot of storm, like strong storms and storm surge, because it's really right next to the ocean. But I learned that the operational team, which is led by local people, they have really creative way to protect themselves, the properties, and they always have the action plan ready and follows closely with the news, and evaluates based on the experience to protect peoples and also parties. So I think those kinds of experience should introduce to a larger group, and perhaps apply to other areas of Vietnam, and share the lesson learned as well as the tips and technique to other community that before they didn't have a lot of storm, but now there's an increase of storm in the areas. That could be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. Certainly a good way to spread resilience, experience, and knowledge. And something I mean, again, regarding resilience awareness, at least, that you kind of brought this to me, but a new idea you're thinking about, I suppose, regarding urban art for resilience awareness raising. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure, of course. But first of all, I would like to correct myself. It's not about like raising awareness. So
Okay.
it's not really about raising awareness or anything, because this term is too technical a term, right? So I think it's about sending the message of sustainability and resilience to people who lives in cities. Perhaps it's not that they don't know about it yet, they're just not familiar with those fancy words, right? We use in academics and professional work. So I think urban arts, whether it's paintings or sketch or music, could send the message to people no less effectively than any formal training workshop. And from how I see it, I think urban arts is always plays a certain roles in urban life. It fills the gap between concrete structures and human souls. But these areas in Vietnam has not yet reached its full potential yet, both in Hanoi or Saigon or everywhere in between. So I really hope to see more urban arts projects that go beyond the mission of beautifying the city, aiming to send the message to everyone living here that I am doing my best to protect you, but also I need you to join me. That is what I hope to see more in city in Vietnam. And I really resonate and felt enlightened by Einstein ideas that no one lives here alone, right? We live in houses built by other people, wear clothes designed and made by others, and benefit from various innovation in our kitchen, right? All made by others. So while we use the resources of society, the breakthroughs that drive the development often come from individuals. So I feel that is the dynamic circulation of energies, and this energy manifests through ex individuals in society. I really get inspired by individuals who carry on the work and share with the communities. So each person counts. its action counts in this sustainability and resilience journey. And I have a lot of thought recently about open arts because I got inspired by an urban sketch artist. He's really enjoy, tell a story into his paintings and his sketch work. And what he shared with me is he really what sparked joy in doing so is when he talked to a homeowners on the street that he just had a sketch, and they invite him into their house and to have some teas and coffee and talk about life in the neighborhood. That is really the real joys within him doing so, and I think that's great. Oh my god, if this can be leverage and enlarge to a bigger group, everyone could share the same interest and translate the message to everyone. It could be an effective way to get people to notice more about being sustainability and resilient. At the same time, preserve, but also keep the beautiful the beauties of urban cultures. It's Vietnamese urban cultures.
Wow, that's all very well said. I really love the idea of using urban art like that as well. And there's some precedent here as well. I know a few years ago, some NGOs did murals about, for example, against not using rhino horn or elephant tusk or wildlife products. And you can still see them. I think it's mostly in Takao, but there's some murals and some others about air pollution and things like that. I mean, it's hard to quantify what impact that has, obviously,
Right.
but it's certainly looks nice. And, if it changes one or two minds, that's worth it, I would say. So I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I hope some of your audience, if anyone who interested in this topic, so I would love to connect and talk more about this.
Yeah, I'll certainly include your contact in the show notes and links to some of your work as well. Well, Mai, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but thank you so much for sharing some thoughts and insight on resilience and sustainability and a couple other topics. Really, really enjoyed this, and I look forward to staying in touch as well. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mike, and I really appreciate your effort in talking about Vietnam and embrace Vietnam to a greater group of audience. And yeah, thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. Please rate or review the Vietnam Weekly podcast on your preferred podcast platform and connect with Vietnam Weekly on Threads, Instagram, or LinkedIn. If you have any feedback or guest ideas, feel free to get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. That's MATATARSKI@gmail.com. And see you next week.